It's strange how some of the darkest stories in history don't begin with monsters. They begin with people who seem completely ordinary. In the early 1900s, in the quiet streets of Copenhagen, there was a woman who blended into everyday life so perfectly that no one ever thought twice about her. Her name was Dagmar Overbye, and at first glance, there was nothing about her that stood out. She wasn't rich, she wasn't powerful, and she certainly didn't look dangerous. If anything, she appeared calm, gentle, even kind. Neighbors would see her going about her day like anyone else, walking through narrow streets, exchanging small smiles, living a life that seemed simple and unremarkable. There was no reason to fear her, no reason to question her, and that, perhaps, is what made everything about her so deeply unsettling, because behind that quiet presence, something else was forming. At that time, life in Denmark wasn't easy, especially for women who found themselves in difficult situations. Society was harsh, judgment came quickly, and options were limited. Many women struggled in silence, carrying burdens they couldn't share openly. And among those struggles, one of the most painful realities was the fate of unwanted or unplanned children. There were mothers young, scared, and often alone, who felt trapped. Some had no support, some feared shame, others simply didn't have the means to raise a child. For them, every day was a battle between love and survival. And in that desperate space, they were willing to trust anyone who offered even the smallest glimpse of hope. That's where Dagmar stepped in. She presented herself as someone who could help, someone who understood, someone who could take those children and find them better homes, places where they would be cared for, loved, and given a future that their mothers couldn't provide. It sounded like a blessing, almost too good to be true. But when you're desperate, you don't question miracles. Dagmar didn't speak loudly or make grand promises. Her approach was quiet, almost comforting. She listened, she nodded. She gave the impression that she genuinely cared. And for many women, that was enough. In a world that often judged them, here was someone who didn't. Imagine the moment. A mother holding her child tightly, knowing she cannot keep them. The fear, the guilt, the heartbreak, it's overwhelming. And then, in that fragile moment, someone like Dagmar appears, offering a solution, a way out, a chance for the child to have a better life. It must have felt like hope, and hope is powerful. Over time, her name began to spread, quietly at first, passed from one person to another, almost like a secret. There's a woman, they would say, who can help. And slowly, more and more people started to seek her out. She became known as someone reliable, someone who could handle what others couldn't. She wasn't just offering a service, she was offering relief, a way to escape a painful reality. But here's the thing about trust. Once it's given, it can blind you. No one stopped to ask too many questions. Where exactly were these children going? Who were the families taking them in? Why was everything handled so privately? These questions either never came up or were quietly ignored. Because when you're holding on to hope, the last thing you want is doubt. Dagmar understood this better than anyone. She knew how to speak to people in their weakest moments. She knew how to create a sense of comfort, even when everything around them felt uncertain. And most importantly, she knew how to make people believe that they were doing the right thing. To the outside world, she looked like a helper, a woman doing a difficult but necessary job, someone who was making life easier for those who had no other options. There was even a certain respect attached to her role. After all, she was taking responsibility for something that others couldn't handle. But sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who hide behind good intentions. There's a certain kind of darkness that doesn't reveal itself immediately. It doesn't come with warning signs or obvious clues. Instead, it grows slowly, quietly, hidden beneath layers of normalcy. And that's exactly what made this story so chilling. Because nothing about Dagmar's life seemed out of place. She wasn't surrounded by chaos. There were no loud arguments, no suspicious behavior that would make people stop and think. Everything about her existence appeared controlled, steady, almost peaceful. And in a way, that calmness became her shield. People trusted what they saw. A simple woman, a helpful figure, someone who stepped in when others walked away. But what people didn't see was far more important. They didn't see what happened after the doors closed. They didn't see the silence that followed. They didn't see the truth that was slowly building behind the scenes, hidden from the world that continued to believe in her. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all of this is how easy it was for her to remain unnoticed. In a busy city where everyone is focused on their own lives, it's not hard for things to slip through the cracks. People mind their own business. They don't interfere. They don't dig deeper unless something forces them to. And in Dagmar's case, nothing did, at least not in the beginning. Everything continued as usual. Mothers came, children were handed over, promises were made, and life moved on. But beneath that routine, something was quietly unfolding, something that no one was prepared for. It's easy, looking back now, to wonder how no one saw it, how no one questioned it sooner. But the truth is, when something is wrapped in kindness, it becomes much harder to suspect. Kindness creates comfort, and comfort lowers defenses. Dagmar didn't need to hide in the shadows, because she was already hiding in plain sight. And as her role in the community grew, so did the number of people who placed their trust in her hands. Each interaction strengthened her image. Each promise made her seem more reliable, more trustworthy, more necessary. But sometimes, the very thing we rely on the most is the thing that can destroy us, because not every helping hand is truly there to help, and not every gentle face tells the truth. As the days turned into months, and months into years, Dagmar Overbye continued to live her quiet life, surrounded by a world that believed in her, a world that saw her as a solution, not a problem. No one could have imagined that behind that calm exterior, behind that soft voice and reassuring presence. There was a story waiting to unfold that would shock not just a city, but an entire nation. A story that would force people to question everything they thought they understood about trust, kindness, and the true face of evil. Because sometimes, evil doesn't look like evil at all. Sometimes, it looks just like Dagmar Overbye. There's a moment in every story where trust becomes the turning point, the invisible line between safety and danger. And in this story, that line was crossed quietly, almost gently, without anyone realizing what it truly meant. As time passed, Dagmar Overbye became more than just a woman in the neighborhood. She became a name, a solution, a whispered answer to a problem no one wanted to talk about openly. Her presence carried a strange kind of comfort, especially for those who felt trapped by their circumstances. For many struggling mothers, life had become a constant weight on their shoulders. Every day was filled with worry, fear, and difficult choices. And when a child was involved, those choices became even more painful. Keeping the baby often meant facing poverty, judgment, or complete isolation. Letting go, on the other hand, felt like losing a piece of their soul. Somewhere between those two unbearable options, Dagmar offered a third. She didn't force anyone. She didn't pressure them. Instead, she listened. She allowed them to speak, to cry, to explain their situation. And then, with a calm and steady voice, she would offer her help. She would tell them that she knew families, good families, who were looking to adopt, families who could give these children a life filled with care and opportunity. It sounded real. It sounded reasonable. And most importantly, it sounded like hope. But hope, when placed in the wrong hands, can become something dangerous. Dagmar's process was simple, yet carefully controlled. She would meet these women in private, often away from prying eyes. The conversations were quiet, almost secretive, as if both sides understood the sensitive nature of what was being discussed. Money was usually involved, framed as a necessary fee for arranging the child's future. And while some may have hesitated at first, desperation often silenced those doubts. When everything was agreed upon, the moment would come. A mother holding her child close, knowing this might be the last time. The air would feel heavy, filled with emotions too strong to put into words. There would be tears, hesitation, and sometimes a final kiss placed gently on the child's forehead. And then the child would be handed over to Dagmar. In that moment, she didn't look like a threat. She looked like a bridge between pain and relief. Someone who was taking responsibility when no one else would. And once the child was in her care, the connection ended. That was part of the arrangement. There were no follow-ups, no visits, no letters. The mothers were told that it was better this way, for both sides, that the child needed to fully adjust to their new life without confusion or attachment to the past. It made sense, at least on the surface. And so, one by one, these stories repeated themselves. Different women, different backgrounds, but the same painful decision. And each time, Dagmar played her role perfectly, calm, reassuring, dependable. Her reputation grew. People began to trust her, not just because of what she said, but because nothing seemed to go wrong. There were no complaints, no reports of failure. In fact, there was only silence. And that silence was interpreted as success, because if something bad had happened, surely someone would have said something, right? But silence can be misleading. In a world where communication wasn't as easy as it is today, it was not uncommon for people to simply lose contact. Especially in cases like these, where everything was handled discreetly. Mothers were often too afraid or ashamed to ask questions. They convinced themselves that their child was somewhere better, living a life they couldn't provide, and that belief became their comfort. Dagmar understood this psychology deeply. She knew that once a mother made the decision to let go, she would cling to the idea that it was the right choice, that her child was safe, happy, and loved. Questioning that belief would only bring pain, so most chose not to, and that allowed Dagmar to continue. Without interruption, there was also something else working in her favor, the society itself. At that time, many people preferred not to get involved in the personal matters of others, especially when it came to issues like illegitimate children or family struggles. It was easier to look away, to mind your own business, and to trust that someone else was handling it. And Dagmar appeared to be that someone else. She became a quiet part of the system, not officially recognized, not openly discussed, but widely accepted. A hidden solution to a visible problem, but beneath that acceptance, something darker was taking shape. The more people trusted her, the more control she gained. And the more control she had, the easier it became to operate without question. It was a cycle that fed itself, growing stronger with each new case. And yet, no one noticed the pattern. No one tracked the number of children passing through her hands. No one verified where they were going. No one followed up on their lives. Each story existed in isolation, disconnected from the others. And because of that, the bigger picture remained hidden. It's almost unsettling to think about how something so serious could happen so openly, yet remain invisible at the same time. Dagmar didn't need to hide what she was doing. She simply needed to control what people believed, and she did that flawlessly. There were moments, of course, when small doubts may have appeared. A question here, a hesitation there, but Dagmar always had an answer. Always a calm explanation that eased concerns and restored confidence. She never raised her voice, never showed panic. Her composure became her greatest weapon, because people trust those who seem in control, and Dagmar was always in control. As her network expanded, so did the number of lives connected to her. Each interaction strengthened her position, making her seem more reliable, more necessary. She wasn't just helping individuals anymore. She had become part of a larger, unspoken system, a system built on trust. But trust, once broken, can reveal truths that are impossible to ignore. At this stage, however, nothing had been broken yet. The illusion was still intact. The image of Dagmar Overbye as a helper, a caretaker, a problem solver, remained untouched. And that's what makes this part of the story so chilling, because everything seemed normal. There were no alarms, no dramatic warnings, just a quiet, steady process that continued day after day, unnoticed and unquestioned, until one day that silence would no longer hold. But for now, the trust remained, and in that trust, the real danger was hiding. There are moments in history when everything looks perfectly normal on the surface, yet beneath that surface, something is quietly starting to crack. For years, life around Dagmar Overbye continued almost unchanged. People went about their daily routines, trusting the systems and the individuals they believed were helping them. Dagmar's role remained the same in the eyes of the public. She was still the woman who offered help, the one who handled difficult situations, the one who stepped in when others couldn't. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to feel different. At first, it wasn't obvious enough to raise alarm. It showed up in small ways, conversations that ended a little too quickly, mothers who seemed uncertain even after making their decision, and then, most importantly, the silence that followed. Because when a child was handed over to Dagmar, there was always an expectation of closure, a new beginning, a life continuing somewhere else, beyond the reach of the past. But in some cases, that closure never truly came. Days would pass, weeks, sometimes longer, and for a few mothers, a quiet doubt would begin to form in the back of their minds. It wasn't loud, it wasn't immediate, it was subtle, like a feeling they couldn't quite explain. They would try to reassure themselves. Maybe the child was adjusting, maybe everything was going as promised, maybe no news was simply a sign that everything was fine. But human instinct is powerful, and when something feels wrong, it often lingers. As time went on, a handful of mothers started to notice that their attempts to reach out were met with delays, vague responses, or no response at all. Letters, if sent, were unanswered. Questions were gently avoided, and in some cases, communication seemed to stop entirely. This was unusual, but still not enough on its own to create immediate suspicion. After all, the arrangement had been presented as something permanent, a clean break, no contact required. Still, the absence of any update began to weigh heavily on some of them. In a few quiet conversations between women, concerns were shared in whispers. "Have you heard anything?" one might ask. "No, nothing at all." another would reply. And in those moments, a shared uncertainty began to form, not strong enough to spark action, but strong enough to plant a seed of doubt. Meanwhile, Dagmar continued her work as before, calm, composed, and consistent. To the outside world, there was no visible change in her behavior, no signs of stress, no visible cracks in her routine. But internally, her operations were growing in scale. More and more children passed through her hands. Each case followed a similar pattern. Each interaction reinforced her position as someone trustworthy. The system around her, unofficial and unregulated, allowed her to function without oversight. And that lack of oversight created space for things to remain hidden. And hidden, they remained for quite some time. Yet, even in environments where control is strong, patterns eventually begin to emerge. Over time, small inconsistencies started to surface, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in fragments. A conversation here that didn't quite align with a previous one, a timeline there that seemed unclear. These weren't enough to form a conclusion, but they were enough to create questions. Some mothers began to recall details they had initially overlooked, the way Dagmar handled certain discussions, the structure of her explanations, the way she redirected conversations when asked about specific outcomes. Individually, these moments didn't seem significant, but together, they created a sense of unease that was difficult to ignore. It's often said that truth reveals itself in patterns, not in single events, and in this case, the pattern was subtle but persistent. Still, action required more than suspicion. It required courage. And for many, the emotional weight of their situation made it difficult to take that step. Admitting that something might be wrong meant reopening a decision they had already struggled to make. So many chose silence. They convinced themselves that no news was good news, that their children were living better lives, that the absence of communication was simply part of the agreement. And for a while, that belief held. But silence has a way of stretching over time, and eventually it becomes uncomfortable. As months passed, the quiet began to feel heavier. Questions that were once pushed aside started to return, not loudly, but steadily. The mind, after all, doesn't forget what it doesn't understand. In some cases, individuals who had previously trusted Dagmar began to reconsider their experience. They replayed their interactions in their minds, searching for anything that might have been overlooked, a detail, a moment, a phrase that might now carry a different meaning. What once felt reassuring now felt uncertain. At the same time, Dagmar's reputation in the community remained largely intact. To those who hadn't personally experienced any issues, she still appeared reliable. There was no widespread alarm, no public warnings, no official concerns raised at that stage. And that contrast between growing internal doubt and outward normalcy created a strange tension in the environment around her. It was as if two realities were existing side by side, one visible, stable, and accepted, the other quiet, uncertain, and slowly building beneath the surface. Dagmar continued to operate within that space without interruption. Each new interaction added another layer to her presence. Each completed arrangement reinforced the perception that everything was functioning as expected. But behind closed doors, the unanswered questions remained. And questions, when left unresolved, have a way of growing. They don't disappear. They wait. They wait for the right moment, the right trigger, the smallest push that might finally bring them into the open. For some, that moment began to approach when inconsistencies could no longer be ignored, when the absence of answers became too noticeable to dismiss, when the gap between expectation and reality became too wide to overlook. It wasn't sudden. It didn't happen all at once. But gradually, the quiet acceptance that had surrounded Dagmar's work began to shift. Doubt, once isolated, started to spread. And once doubt enters the picture, it changes everything. Because doubt leads to questions, and questions lead to attention. Attention, in turn, brings scrutiny, and scrutiny has a way of revealing things that were never meant to be seen. At this stage, the story had not yet reached its breaking point. The surface still appeared intact. Dagmar's role still seemed unchanged, but beneath that surface, the foundation was beginning to show the earliest signs of instability. The trust that had once supported everything was no longer as solid as before. And though no one could see the full picture yet, the first cracks had already begun to form. Quietly, slowly, and without warning, they were about to grow. Sometimes, it only takes one small crack for an entire illusion to begin falling apart. And in this story, that crack started quietly. almost unnoticed at first, before it slowly turned into something that could no longer be ignored. For years, the name Dagmar Overbye had been associated with trust, with help, with solutions to difficult problems that many people preferred not to face directly. Her role in the community seemed steady, unchanged, and for a long time, no one had reason to question the structure she had built around herself. But beneath that calm surface, things had started to shift. It didn't begin with a dramatic event or a sudden revelation. Instead, it started with uncertainty, small inconsistencies that began to catch the attention of people who had once placed their trust in her. A few individuals started to feel that something didn't quite add up. Not enough to accuse, not enough to confront, but enough to question quietly. And questions, once they begin, rarely stay silent for long. One particular case became the turning point. It wasn't immediately clear why, but there was something different this time. A concern that had been lingering in the background now began to surface more clearly. A mother who had trusted Dagmar with her child started to feel uneasy, not because of a single event, but because of the absence of one. There were no updates, no confirmation, no reassurance that aligned with what she had expected. The silence that followed the handover no longer felt normal. It felt empty. At first, she tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that perhaps the arrangement was working exactly as promised. But as days passed, that quiet reassurance began to fade, replaced by a growing sense that something wasn't right. She wasn't alone. Others too had begun to share similar concerns in private conversations. Stories that seemed isolated at first started to overlap. Patterns began to emerge, not obvious ones, but subtle connections that became harder to dismiss the more they were discussed. And this time, unlike before, the doubts didn't stay contained. They began to spread beyond whispers. Eventually, these growing concerns reached a point where someone decided not to remain silent. A formal complaint was raised, not a loud accusation, but a careful, hesitant step toward asking questions that had long been avoided. It was enough to trigger attention from the authorities, and once attention shifted, everything changed. The moment the authorities became involved, the situation was no longer a series of private arrangements. It became something that required examination, verification, and truth. What had once operated in the shadows of trust was now under a different kind of light, one that did not rely on reputation or assumptions, but on evidence. Investigators began to look into the cases associated with Dagmar. They started with the most recent concerns, then worked their way backward, trying to understand the full scope of her activities. Records were reviewed, individuals were questioned, details were compared. At first, the information appeared incomplete. There were gaps in documentation, inconsistencies in accounts, and a general lack of traceable outcomes for the children who had been placed through her. That alone raised concern, because in a system that should leave behind some form of record, the absence of clarity became its own kind of warning sign. As more cases were examined, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The number of children connected to Dagmar was higher than expected, and yet, for many of them, there was no clear information about their whereabouts after the initial transfer. This was not something that could be easily explained away. The deeper the investigation went, the more questions began to surface. Each answer seemed to lead to another gap, another missing piece. It became clear that this was not an isolated misunderstanding. There was something fundamentally wrong in the way these arrangements had been handled. And at the center of it all was Dagmar herself. When authorities finally moved forward with direct action, they approached her with the weight of their findings still developing. But even then, the tone of the situation had already changed. What had once been viewed as a private role in the community was now being examined under suspicion. Dagmar, who had operated with calm confidence for so long, was now facing scrutiny that she could no longer control. The investigation reached her personal space. Her home, once seen as ordinary, became the focus of a careful search. Officers examined the environment, looking for anything that could help explain the unanswered questions surrounding the missing children. And what they found added an entirely new dimension to the case. Inside her residence, investigators discovered evidence that did not align with the narrative she had presented to the public. There were signs that suggested something far more disturbing was happening behind closed doors. Items, belongings, and conditions that raised immediate concern and demanded further analysis. The atmosphere shifted instantly. What had been a quiet suspicion now turned into something concrete enough to act upon. The case was no longer based on doubt alone. It was now supported by findings that pointed toward serious wrongdoing. As the evidence accumulated, the authorities began to connect the dots between multiple cases. Children who had been handed over through Dagmar's arrangements were now part of a larger investigation that suggested a pattern of harm rather than care. The realization was difficult to process because it meant that the trust placed in her had not just been misplaced, it had been exploited in a way that no one had anticipated. News of the investigation began to spread, slowly at first, then more widely, as the seriousness of the situation became clearer. People in the community who had once seen Dagmar as a helpful figure were now confronted with a reality that challenged everything they believed about her. Shock began to replace confidence, confusion replaced certainty, and questions that had once been whispered in private were now being asked openly. How could this have happened for so long without detection? How many lives were affected? And most importantly, how had someone in such a position managed to operate without raising earlier alarm? The answers were not simple. What became clear, however, was that the combination of trust, silence, and lack of oversight had created an environment where her actions could continue without interruption for far longer than anyone expected. As the investigation deepened, the full scope of the situation began to come into focus. The pieces that were once scattered started to form a picture that was both complex and deeply unsettling. The authorities were no longer just dealing with individual reports. They were now uncovering something much larger, something that required careful examination and accountability at every level. And at the center of it all remained the same figure who had once been trusted without question. The transition from trust to investigation had been triggered by a single concern, but what it revealed went far beyond what anyone had imagined. The illusion that had held for so long was no longer intact. And as the truth began to emerge, it became clear that this was not just about one person's actions. It was about the consequences of unquestioned trust and how easily silence can allow something dangerous to grow unnoticed. At this stage, the situation had reached a point where there was no turning back. The questions had been asked, the investigation had begun, and the answers were finally starting to come into the light. There are moments when the truth finally comes into the light, and when it does, it doesn't just answer questions. It changes everything you thought you understood. By the time the investigation into Dagmar Overbye had fully taken shape, the atmosphere surrounding her had completely transformed. The woman who was once seen as a quiet helper was no longer viewed through the same lens. The trust that had protected her for so long had disappeared, replaced by disbelief, anger, and a growing sense of horror. As more evidence was uncovered, the reality became impossible to deny. The children who had been entrusted to her care were never reaching the future that had been promised to their mothers. The hopeful stories, the idea of new homes and better lives, all of it began to collapse under the weight of truth. For the families involved, this realization was devastating. Imagine believing for months, even years, that your child was somewhere safe, growing up in a loving home, only to discover that this belief was built on something false. The emotional impact of that truth is difficult to describe. It wasn't just grief, it was confusion, guilt, and a deep sense of betrayal that cut through everything. Many of those mothers had made the hardest decision of their lives when they handed over their children. They had done it believing it was the right thing, and now they were forced to face the possibility that their trust had led to something unimaginable. As the case moved forward, Dagmar herself was taken into custody. The calm, composed figure that people had known for so long was now standing at the center of a serious criminal investigation. There was no longer any distance between her and the accusations. Everything was now being examined directly. During questioning, the reality of her actions began to surface in ways that shocked even the investigators. The scale of what had happened, the pattern behind it, and the time over which it had continued, all pointed to something far more disturbing than anyone had initially expected. The image she had built over the years of kindness, of help, of quiet reliability was now completely shattered, and in its place was something much darker. As details of the case became public, the reaction from society was immediate and intense. People struggled to understand how someone like Dagmar could exist within their community without raising earlier alarm. The sense of collective shock spread quickly, turning into a larger conversation about trust, responsibility, and the hidden dangers that can exist beneath ordinary appearances. The story was no longer private. It had become something that affected an entire nation. Newspapers reported on the case. Discussions filled public spaces, and people began to question systems that had once been taken for granted. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? Why were there no checks in place? And how many lives had been affected before the truth finally came out? These questions didn't have easy answers. What they did reveal, however, was a deeper issue, one that went beyond a single individual. It showed how silence, combined with trust, can create conditions where even the most serious actions remain hidden. It showed how easily people can accept something as normal, simply because it appears to be working. And perhaps most importantly, it showed how dangerous it can be when no one asks questions. Dagmar's case eventually moved into the legal system, where her actions were formally addressed. The process was thorough, detailed, and closely followed by the public. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every detail added to the understanding of what had taken place. For many, sitting through the facts of the case was deeply unsettling. It forced them to confront a reality that didn't fit with the image they had once believed in. It was no longer possible to separate the woman they thought they knew from the actions that had now been revealed. And as the legal proceedings continued, one thing became clear. This was not just about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of what had happened, acknowledgement of the lives affected, and acknowledgement of the trust that had been broken in such a profound way. When the final judgment was delivered, it marked the official end of one part of the story, but not the emotional impact that would follow. Justice, in a legal sense, had been served. But for those who had lived through it, the consequences were far more personal and far more lasting. There are wounds that don't simply heal with time. For the families, the truth would always carry a weight, a question of what if that could never truly be answered, a memory of a moment when they made a choice, believing it was the best one, only to later discover that it led somewhere they never intended. And for society as a whole, the case left behind a lasting impression. It changed the way people viewed trust. It made them more cautious, more aware, and perhaps a little more questioning of situations that once seemed harmless. It highlighted the importance of transparency, of accountability, and of not accepting things at face value without understanding what lies beneath. Because sometimes, the most dangerous situations are not the ones that look threatening, but the ones that look completely safe. Dagmar Overbye's story became more than just a case. It became a symbol, a reminder of how easily appearances can deceive and how important it is to look beyond them. Even years later, the story continues to be remembered, not just for the actions themselves, but for what they revealed about human behavior, trust, and the systems we rely on. It stands as a warning, quiet but powerful, a reminder that not every helping hand is truly there to help, a reminder that trust, while necessary, should never be given blindly, and perhaps most importantly, a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, has a way of finding its way to the surface. Because in the end, no matter how carefully something is concealed, no matter how long it remains in the shadows, it cannot stay hidden forever, and when it finally comes into the light, it changes everything.